For 3 years, Hazel Drummond was the hospital's ghost. The paramedic nobody paged, the trauma tech nobody remembered, the woman who showed up before dawn to restock the supply room and left after midnight when the last chart was filed. At St. Brendan's Regional Medical Center in Thunder Bay, Ontario, ghosts were useful. They did the work nobody else wanted. They didn't complain, and they certainly didn't talk back. Hazel was 34, though the nurses who bothered to glance at her assumed she was older. She had the kind of stillness that made people uncomfortable. Not the stillness of someone shy, but the stillness of someone who had learned, at great cost, to keep the dangerous parts of herself very quiet. She wore her dark hair in a flat, functional braid. Her scrubs were always clean, but perpetually a size too large, hiding a frame that was lean and scarred in ways that had no business being on a trauma tech at a regional hospital in Northern Ontario. She had been assigned to the emergency department's support team. The people who weren't quite nurses, weren't quite paramedics in the formal hospital sense, but were absolutely essential when the department actually functioned. Hazel transported patients. She restocked crash carts. She cleaned trauma bays between cases with a methodical, almost ritualistic efficiency that the senior nurses found mildly unsettling. She never seemed rattled, not by blood, not by screaming, not by the particular brand of controlled chaos that descended on St. Brendan's ED every Friday night when the logging camps outside the city had paid out for the week. Her direct supervisor was a man named Colton Briggs. Briggs was 42, had a master's certificate in healthcare administration framed on his office wall, and referred to himself in team meetings as a clinical operations architect. He had never, in Hazel's memory, actually set foot inside an active trauma bay. He managed schedules and budgets from behind a glass-walled office that looked out over the nursing station. And he had a particular gift for making Hazel feel that her continued employment was an act of his personal generosity. Drummond. Briggs had a way of saying her last name that made it sound like a mild accusation. He appeared at her elbow one Thursday morning while she was reorganizing the medication fridge, which she did every Thursday because nobody else did it, and the consequences of a disorganized medication fridge in an emergency department were the kind she had seen up close in places Briggs could not imagine. "I need you on external transport today. There's a patient transfer to the Kakabeka facility at 1400. That keeps you out of the ED for the afternoon." He paused. "We have a hospital administration review happening at 1500. Regional Health Authority. Director wants the department to look its best. I think it's better if you're not around." Hazel turned from the fridge. "I have 2 patients in Bay 3 and Bay 7 I've been monitoring. The RNs will handle it." Briggs cut her off. "You're a support tech, Drummond. You support. You don't monitor." He smiled the way people smile when they're certain they're winning. "The transfer van is at the loading dock at 13:30. Don't be late." She wasn't late. She was never late. And while she was driving a 73-year-old man with a hip replacement to a long-term care facility 40 minutes outside the city, Colton Briggs was in the ED shaking hands with the Regional Health Authority's inspection team and taking personal credit for the department's supply chain improvements that Hazel had implemented in her first month on the job. She had known what she was walking into when she took the position. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that the job required her to care, and Hazel Drummond, try as she had never been able to stop caring. Not about the patients, not about the outcomes, It was a flaw, she had decided. A structural defect she had been born with that no amount of discipline had ever fully corrected. The rest of the staff existed in a comfortable hierarchy around her. Above Briggs was Dr. Pamela Voss, the department chief, a sharp-faced woman in her 50s who ran the ED with the precision of someone who had been doing it for 20 years and fully intended to do it for 20 more. Voss was not cruel. She was simply efficient, and efficiency had no room in it for noticing people like Hazel Drummond. There were also the senior nurses, women and men, who had earned their authority through years of genuinely hard work, and who therefore resented, on principle, anyone who arrived quietly and seemed to possess competencies that nobody had officially sanctioned. And then there was Dr. Jordan Hext. Hext was the department's star, 38. Trained at Dalhousie, had done a fellowship in Calgary, and possessed the specific brand of confidence that comes from being told, repeatedly by institutions you respect, that you are exceptional. He was not wrong about his abilities. He was a genuinely skilled emergency physician. He was also the kind of man who filled a room so completely with his own presence that he could stand next to someone for 8 months and still not know their name. He called Hazel the tech, as in, can someone get the tech to bring another set of leads? Or where's the tech? I need this bay cleaned before my next patient. She had corrected him twice, early on. After the second time, she stopped. The name didn't matter. Names were surface. She had learned that in places where names were the first thing you lost. What nobody at St. Brendan's knew, what nobody in Thunder Bay knew, including her landlord, her neighbor, and the woman at the Tim Hortons on Memorial Avenue who remembered her usual order, was that Hazel Drummond's real name was Hazel Drummond. That part was true. Everything else they thought they understood about her was a deliberate act of omission. She had been a combat medic. Joint Task Force 2, support attached, forward medical. The specific designation still classified in ways she had no interest in discussing. She had served 2 rotations in Afghanistan, and one in a location she had never been authorized to name on any form. That wasn't a security clearance document. She had performed field surgery in the back of a damaged ALAV, with a headlamp and the contents of a trauma kit that was never designed for what she used it for. She had a scar that ran from her right collarbone to just below her shoulder blade, courtesy of a situation that had ended better than it had any right to. And she had a military service record that, if anyone at St. Brendan's had been permitted to read it, would have made Briggs's glass-walled office feel very small indeed. She had taken her medical release 18 months after the last rotation. Not because she'd wanted to, because the doctors at the CF Health Services Center in Ottawa had told her, politely but without room for argument, that her body had paid a price she could no longer refuse to acknowledge. She had come to Thunder Bay because she had grown up 2 hours north of it, and because she knew instinctively that she needed somewhere quiet enough to relearn how to exist without a mission briefing. She had not told anyone at St. Brendan's any of this. She was not legally required to, and she had decided, in the parking lot of the hospital on her first day, that the position of invisible trauma tech was exactly the mission profile she needed for the foreseeable future. The foreseeable future lasted until the second Tuesday in February at 11:47 at night. Hazel was the only experienced person in the trauma wing when the radio crackled. Briggs had sent the senior trauma RN home early to manage an overtime budget problem he was presenting at a meeting the following morning. The charge nurse on shift, a recent hire named Devereaux, who was perfectly competent at stable patients and entirely unprepared for what was coming, was managing a difficult IV insertion in Bay 4. Dr. Hext had stepped out to take a call from a specialist in Winnipeg. The department was running, as it did on certain late winter nights, on the administrative equivalent of a wing and a prayer. Hazel was at the supply cart outside Bay 2 when the radio call came through the speaker above the nursing station. She heard it the way she heard everything in medical environments, with her full attention, always, even when she appeared to be looking at nothing. The paramedic's voice on the other end was controlled but tight in the particular way that meant the situation was bad enough that control was costing something. Incoming code trauma. Male, 26 years old, Canadian Army, Petawawa-based, presenting for emergency leave compassionate visit. Motorcycle accident on Highway 17, westbound. Struck by a transport truck that drifted lanes. Traumatic brain injury suspected. Tension pneumothorax developing. Blood pressure 68/40 and falling. 2 large Boravzin 2 units of ONEG hung. ETA, 4 minutes. 4 minutes. Hazel put down the box of IV lines she was holding. She walked to the nursing station and pressed the emergency department alert button, the one that flooded the overhead lights and triggered the internal page. Then she picked up the direct line to Hext's mobile. He answered on the 3rd ring. "I'm on a consult call." "You have a code trauma incoming in 4 minutes, Hazel said. Her voice had changed. She didn't notice it change. It was simply what happened when the situation required it. A register shift, a flattening of affect, a clarity of tone that belonged to a different context than supply carts and medication fridges. 26-year-old male, active military, tension pneumo developing, BP 68/40. You need to be in Trauma 1 right now. A pause. Who is this? Drummond, the tech. She hung up and went to Trauma 1. Devereux appeared at the bay entrance 30 seconds later, still holding a piece of gauze. What's happening? Code trauma, 4 minutes. Suisse. I need the massive transfusion protocol tray, the thoracostomy kit, and a Belmont rapid infuser primed. Hazel was already pulling the crash cart into position, checking leads, checking the airway trolley with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this in considerably worse conditions. Can you run the MTP tray? Yes, but shouldn't we wait for Dr. Hext too? He's coming. We don't wait on prep. Hazel looked at her directly, not unkindly, but directly. MTP tray, now. You can do this. Devereux moved. Hext arrived 90 seconds later, still in his coat, phone in hand. He took one look at the trauma bay, the primed infuser, the organized tray, the leads in place. And then he looked at Hazel, who was standing at the head of the bed, calm as concrete. Good setup, he said, and she could tell he was surprised, and she could tell he wasn't sure why. The paramedics came through the doors at 11:51. The patient was young and large, and he was fighting, which was both a good sign and a terrible complication. His body was resisting unconsciousness with the stubbornness of someone who had been trained not to go down, and that resistance was burning through the last of his physiological reserve, at a rate that the monitors made very clear. His name, per his ID bracelet, was Corporal Ryan Atchison. He had a maple leaf tattooed on the inside of his left wrist. Dog tags around his neck read 3 RCR, 3rd Battalion, Royal Canadian Regiment. Hazel read the tags in the time it took Hext to cross to the other side of the bed. She had served alongside 3 RCR support elements in Kandahar province in 2011. She knew what their soldiers looked like. She knew what it cost a unit to lose one. Pressures dropped to 62, the paramedic called. He's been fighting the oxygen mask the whole way in. Nah, he can't expand his left lung, Hazel said. She was watching the paradoxical chest movement, the left side rising when it should fall, falling when it should rise. Classic tension pneumothorax presentation, textbook. If you had read the textbooks somewhere, that wasn't actually a textbook. The tension's building. He needs needle decompression right now or we lose him in the next 90 seconds. I see it, Hext said, reaching for the large bore needle. His hands were steady. To his credit, Jordan Hext was a good physician, but his hands hesitated. The specific hesitation of someone who has done this in controlled simulations and is now doing it in the real, which was a different thing entirely. The monitor alarm changed pitch. The rhythm on the screen deteriorated. Akason's oxygen saturation dropped through the floor. Hazel stepped forward. I've got it. She didn't ask. She moved with the flat authority of someone whose entire nervous system had been calibrated for this specific category of emergency. And she placed the needle at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and drove it in with a precision that was not possible to simulate and was not possible to teach in Ilklagolner Hall. The rush of trapped air was immediate. The monitor shifted. The rhythm steadied. Chest tube next, she said, already reaching. Left side, I need a 14 French and a drainage unit. Devereaux handed her exactly what she asked for without being asked twice. Hex said nothing. He watched her work with the expression of a man who was recalibrating something significant. The chest tube went in. Blood drained into the canister. Too much, but draining, which meant the pressure was releasing. Hazel called for blood, called for the second unit of ONEG, called the OR charge nurse directly on the wall phone to tell them trauma 1 was sending up an active hemorrhage patient in the next 15 minutes, and she needed a surgical team ready. She did all of this while simultaneously monitoring the man's airway, his pressure, his rhythm, coordinating Devereaux on the medication pushes, and talking Hext through the next decision point in a tone that was not condescending and was not deferential. It was simply the tone of someone who knew what needed to happen and was making sure it happened. By midnight, Corporal Ryan Atchison had a blood pressure of 94/60 and was being wheeled to the elevator for surgery. He was alive. The math on that, had anyone taken the time to do it, was not comfortable. Dr. Voss arrived at 12:20. She had been called by the overnight administrator once the code trauma came in, and she had come directly from her home in the south end of the city, which meant she had been there for roughly 20 minutes of the actual emergency. She walked into a trauma bay that was organized, documented, and staffed by a trauma tech who was completing the incident notes with the concise, acronym-dense precision of someone who had written field medical reports under time pressure since before this department had hired her. Voss looked at the notes. She looked at Hext. "Walk me through it," she said. Hext told her. He told her accurately, which Hazel noted and did not expect. He said the needle decompression had been performed by the support tech because the deterioration had been too rapid for standard protocol, and the tech's assessment had been correct. He said the chest tube had been placed by the support tech as well, and that he had supervised, which was a version of events that's generous to him but not technically false. He said Corporal Atchison was in surgery with a realistic prognosis because of decisions made in the first 4 minutes. Voss turned to look at Hazel. Hazel was still writing notes. "Drummond," Voss said. "Yes, you performed an invasive procedure. I performed the procedure that kept him alive while the physician oriented." Hazel did not look up from the chart. The timeline is documented. You can review it. Voss was quiet for a moment. You have no surgical authorization on your credential file. No. Then I have a significant problem. You have a living soldier, Hazel said quietly, instead of a dead one. I understand if that creates a paperwork problem. It was the most words she had said at one time in 3 years of working at St. Brendan's. The paperwork problem, as it turned out, was only the beginning. Corporal Atchison survived surgery. He was in the ICU for 4 days. On the 5th day, he was transferred to a step-down unit and began the slow process of being well enough to be furious about what had happened to his motorcycle. His unit, 3rd Battalion Royal Canadian Regiment, was notified of his status. His commanding officer, a woman named Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Nwosu, was on compassionate leave protocol and in contact with the hospital. What happened next? Nobody at St. Brendan's had planned for. On the 9th day after the accident, at exactly 1400 hours, the main entrance of the emergency department opened, and 6 members of the Canadian Armed Forces walked in. Not in combat kit, in service dress, the dark CAD-PAT ceremonials, buttons polished, badges correct, with the particular quality of bearing that comes from having been told, since the beginning of your military life, that how you carry yourself in public is a form of communication. At the front of the group was Lieutenant Colonel Nwosu. Behind her were 2 captains and 3 warrant officers. One of the warrant officers was carrying a small case. Briggs was at the nursing station. He had spent the morning preparing a presentation for the Regional Health Authority on staff utilization efficiency. He saw the military detail come through the doors, and his face arranged itself into the expression of a man who understood, instinctively, that something significant was happening and who intended to position himself at the center of it. He stepped forward. Lieutenant Colonel, welcome to St. Brendan's Regional. I'm Colton Briggs, Director of Emergency Operations. We're so honored to have you. Corporal Atchison is doing wonderfully. I've been personally overseeing his care since he came in. Nwosu looked at him the way people look at a sign in a language they don't speak. Then she looked past him. Her eyes went to the far end of the hallway, where Hazel Drummond was wheeling an empty transport chair back from the elevator. Hazel's back was to the military detail. She was wearing her usual oversized scrubs. Her braid had a piece of medical tape stuck to it that she hadn't noticed. She was the least remarkable-looking person in the corridor. Nwosu said, quietly, to the captain at her right, "That's her." The captain nodded. The entire military detail walked past Briggs, past the nursing station, past the curious cluster of nurses who had emerged from bay doors, down the corridor. Hazel heard the footsteps, the specific cadence of people who had been trained to walk in formation, and she turned. She went very still. Nwosu stopped 2 feet in front of her. She came to attention. The sound of 6 pairs of heels coming together in a tiled hospital corridor was, in the silence, extremely loud. She raised her right hand in a salute, crisp, deliberate, the kind that is not a formality but a statement. "Warrant Officer 2nd Class Drummond," Nwosu said. Her voice was even and controlled, and something underneath it was not controlled at all. "The 3rd Battalion extends its formal respects. Corporal Atchison asked us to come." Behind Nwosu, the entire detail held the salute. Behind Hazel, the emergency department of St. Brendan's Regional Medical Center had stopped completely. Monitors beeped into an absolute silence. Briggs stood at the nursing station with his hand still partially extended from the handshake Nwosu had not taken. Dr. Hext, who had come out of Bay 2 to see what the footsteps were, stood against the wall with an expression that suggested he was revising several things simultaneously. Hazel stood with the transport chair handle in her hand and let the salute land. She didn't drop her eyes. She had learned a long time ago not to drop her eyes. Then she straightened. Her spine, which had been carrying the deliberately diminished posture of someone trying to occupy less space for 3 years, found its natural position. Her shoulders settled. Her chin came level. The transformation was not dramatic. It was simply the removal of something she had been wearing that was never hers. "At ease, ma'am," she said. Nwosu lowered her hand. The detail went to rest. The lieutenant colonel's jaw was tight in the way of someone managing an emotion that is not appropriate for the situation but is present regardless. "Corporal Atchison told us what happened," Nwosu said. He was conscious enough in the first few minutes to understand what was being done to him. He asked us to find out who. She paused. "We found out who. He would have done the same," Hazel said. "Any of your people would have. Not like that." Nwosu glanced briefly at the trauma bay, not without the equipment or the authorization or anyone to back them up. She looked back at Hazel. "Command ran your service record when your name came up. They want me to communicate that your citation is, that what you did here is." She stopped, started again. "We spent 3 years trying to find you after your release. You fell off every registry we had." "I needed to fall off," Hazel said simply. "I understand that." Nwosu's voice was quieter now. "I'm not here to pull you back. I'm here because that young man is alive and his family knows it and his unit knows it, and we needed you to know that we know it." The warrant officer with the case stepped forward. He opened it. Inside, on a felt backing, was a folded Canadian flag and a formal letter on Department of National Defense letterhead. A letter of commendation, signed at a level that Briggs, if he had been literate in the relevant hierarchy, would have found deeply humbling. Hazel looked at it for a long moment. She didn't take it yet. From behind the nursing station, Briggs had collected himself enough to step forward again. He had made a rapid internal calculation, the kind that middle managers perform when they realize the political landscape has shifted and they have been standing on the wrong piece of it. His voice was careful and warm and almost entirely unconvincing. "This is wonderful," Briggs said. "We're so proud of what Hazel contributes to our team." "Absolutely. And I think this reflects well on the whole department, Mr. Briggs." "Doctor." Voss had appeared from her office. She had been watching from the doorway. Her voice was the voice of someone who had made a decision. "I'll take it from here." Briggs closed his mouth. Voss walked to Hazel. She stopped beside her and looked at Nwosu. "Lieutenant Colonel," Voss said, "I owe this woman an overdue conversation, and I think you may be able to help me have it." She turned to Hazel. "Your credential file has significant gaps. You've filled them with competencies that have apparently been verified by the Canadian Armed Forces and by what I watched on the Trauma Bay camera footage last week. I should have looked at that footage on day 1 instead of treating the outcome as a liability." She paused. "I didn't ask the right questions when I hired you. That's on me." Hazel said nothing. "I'm asking them now." Voss looked at her steadily. "What are you qualified to do?" There was a silence. Somewhere in the department, a cardiac monitor beeped. A phone rang and was answered. "More than what you've been using me for," Hazel said. It was not a boast. It was a factual statement, delivered in the tone of someone who had waited 3 years to say it and was not particularly enjoying the moment. The satisfaction people assumed she would feel, the vindication, the triumph, was not what was present on her face. What was present was something more complicated, the specific weight of having been invisible for a long time and being required to become visible again. Voss nodded. I know. She looked at Briggs. Colton, I need you to pull the staffing authority documentation for a lateral position reclassification. Today. Briggs opened his mouth. Today, Voss said again. He left. What happened in the following hours was not a dramatic scene. It was mostly paperwork, which is what real reckonings in hospital administration look like. Hazel sat in Voss's office with 2 HR representatives, and the KAF liaison officer Nwosu had brought. And together, they built a document trail that reflected what her qualifications actually were. The military training equivalencies, the field surgical experience, the trauma certifications that had existed in her service record for years, and had simply never been translated into the civilian credentialing language that the hospital required. It was slow. It was unglamorous. Hazel answered every question directly and without embellishment. Briggs submitted the reclassification paperwork because Voss told him to, and because he understood without anyone spelling it out that the alternative scenarios were worse for him than this one. He was not, that evening, a person who had been publicly destroyed. He was simply a person who had lost the ability to give Hazel Drummond a transport assignment, to keep her out of sight during a meeting. The difference between those two things was significant, and Hazel understood it. She did not ask for his humiliation. She had never wanted it. What she asked for in Voss's office was specific, a reclassified position as a senior trauma practitioner, with a scope of practice that reflected her actual training, a mentorship structure for the junior staff who needed it. She named Devereux, who had performed well under pressure and deserved to be developed properly, and a review of the department's overnight staffing model, which had left a trauma bay covered by one unprepared charge nurse and a support tech on the worst possible night. The review, she noted without looking at Briggs's documentation on Voss's desk, should probably not have been delayed by budget presentations. Nwosu stayed through the afternoon. When the paperwork was done, she found Hazel in the supply room. Old habits, reorganizing the same medication fridge she had been reorganizing when Briggs had told her to stay out of sight. You could come back, Nwosu said, not asking, not pushing, just saying it as a fact that existed, not to active service. There are civilian roles, advisement, training. The CAF needs people who can teach what you know. Hazel considered the fridge. She closed the door. There's a first-year paramedic student at this hospital, she said, who nearly watched a 26-year-old die because nobody in the department had taught her the difference between a simple pneumothorax and a tension pneumo. She did everything right after. She handed me the right kit without being asked twice. She just needed the knowledge. She picked up her clipboard. That's what's in front of me right now. Nwosu was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded, slowly, with the expression of someone who recognizes a calling when they see it, even in a supply room in Thunder Bay in February. Corporal Atchison is asking to meet you, she said. When he's well enough, I know. Hazel paused at the door. Tell him he can come find me. I'll be here. She walked back out into the emergency department, not to the supply cart at the edge of the room, not to the shadow side of the nursing station, but to the center of it, to the whiteboard where the department's active cases were tracked. And she picked up the marker and began to write, in the clean and authoritative hand of someone who had been writing field notes in difficult conditions for a decade. The department adjusted around her, not dramatically, not with ceremony. The way departments adjust when someone stops apologizing for the space they occupy and simply begins to fill it properly. Corporal Atchison came to find her 3 weeks later, walking on a cane, thinner than his service photo but upright. He found her in the trauma bay, running a simulation with 2 paramedic students. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching. She didn't notice him until the simulation was done. When she turned and saw him, something crossed her face. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one, the specific softening of someone who has learned to feel things at a careful distance and is choosing, for this moment, not to maintain that distance. "Corporal," she said. "Warrant officer," he said. He stood at attention, not with the full formal salute. His shoulder wasn't there yet, but he stood at attention with everything he had available. "Thank you." Hazel looked at him for a long time. At the man who was standing in front of her because of a decision she had made in 90 seconds in a trauma bay at midnight, at the maple leaf tattoo on his wrist, at the set of his jaw, which was young and tired and trying hard to be steady. "Don't thank me," she said finally, her voice quiet and without performance. "Heal right. Come back stronger. That's what you owe me." He nodded. His throat worked. She turned back to her paramedic students, who were watching with the wide, still attention of people who understood they were witnessing something they would remember. "All right," she said. "Next scenario. Penetrating trauma, tension pneumo, rural setting, limited kit. You have 90 seconds before your patient deteriorates. What's your first move?"